A silver lining refers to something that could be considered good in the event that something is generally considered not to be. I can't say the same about this game, however, particularly concerning its story and its combat gameplay. So I don't play games or particularly like making videos about them just to say something is bad, as I realize hating over a game isn't fun, and yet at the same time, I feel inclined to say something about this one. I don't hate the game as much as I dislike how they fumbled the execution of what could have been, especially given how many years Game Freak has been in the business. It really isn't worth the money, as whatever it does seems acceptable at best initially, but after beating hard mode, well, I want to put the warning that you should avoid this game unfortunately. It's ironic as I played Giga Wrecker, a rather modest, low-budget title from Game Freak in 2017, and somehow, I see the almost exact same issues in terms of design or lack thereof that makes up the game experience. I was thinking at first, well, the game isn't so bad, but from start to finish, it takes its approach to game design in the same exact formulaic patterns that almost mirrors its attempts at that low-budget indie title in my experience. It is so jarring in that respect that that sense of game design is immediately drained from the creative medium that makes you question if reviewers scoring an 8 out of 10 or above are disingenuous. I'm confused as I'm really wondering if we're playing the same game. That's the beauty of opinions, I suppose. But the game really focuses on the wrong things while leaving the actual game design to be as bare bones as possible in my experience, however. Beast of Reincarnation fails to say anything new, interesting, or just something worth investing your time into, especially for the price. I'm not saying this is a bad faith argument or anything, but more so if I came out of this more disappointed than angry or sad at spending my time and money to play this game. This was one of my anticipated games I was looking forward to playing, given Game Freak's rather bold attempt at something new. I think a major issue is that they're too afraid of making a game that won't appeal to everyone, as you might have heard the phrase, a game for everyone is a game for no one. It's as if they're too afraid of making players struggle given its potential influences like Sekiro or Nier. And so what's here is a 5 out of 10 game. It doesn't really do much wrong to be genuinely awful, though that's debatable, but it also doesn't reach to do anything beyond a bare minimum quality in many respects. I think the worst kind of experience is one that you really didn't feel anything afterwards, and that's exactly what this was for me. After the 32 hours I took to explore to see if there's anything worthwhile, I can say that there's nothing contrary to this rather negative outlook. If you play this game, you can really tell how by the numbers things are that really doesn't inspire confidence. It's genuinely not a good time later. So what starts as perhaps a 6 or 7 out of 10 devolves into a 5 out of 10 at best, as the story elements are a jarring mess at points in which the game actually simply dumps its story in one chapter far into the experience. The maps become far shorter without increasing the story focus or relative scope, and the combat gameplay is also not explored enough alongside its RPG customization for builds. Huge spoilers by the way, as I'm laying into the story especially, but no, not for the reasons of its stunted or intentionally expressed story conventions that attempt to escape its criticisms like the lacking facial expressions, but looking past that, what is here arguably is really poor. So foremost, I'd consider the game to be an action-adventure game, as otherwise, it's a mashup between something like a slower Sekiro for general combat, and God of War for its abilities regulated by Ku, the dog. Beast of Reincarnation actually has some fairly good implied writing points that will make you go, oh, neat. For instance, humans that have their souls transferred into machines are called golems. Golems in mythology are man-made or artificial constructs at a lower level than human. It's implying that, as humanity has evolved without the factors of feeling dread, their souls or spiritual makeup is deteriorating. So golems, who cannot escape their corruption even through advanced technological means, are no longer human by their voluntary willingness to remove their biological physicality, even given their best intentions to maintain human ethos and culture. They aren't human by the idea that they stripped away the very essences for an ideal that ironically makes them further from it. That's very profound in a way. Or take how the main character, Emma, gains permanent stat boosts from eating new foods for the first time. I think the implication is that for someone who's emotionally unfeeling from not only humanity's emotionally stunted evolution, but also through plot-related reasons, she is engineered for the purpose of becoming a tool for a greater purpose. She finds food mainly as an energy source, and many consider her to be basically only human in the flesh. She even later notes that she barely even tastes food, yet comes around to the act of enjoying a meal. It's a small detail in the self-reflection of hinting and challenging her own sense of humanity, as practically anyone looks forward to eating good and different sorts of food, especially with others. It's something almost on an instinctual level that's so deeply human. It's in seemingly mundane moments like this that awakens and clashes with Emma's robotic aptitude to follow violent directives and fulfilling her orders. So subtle things like that pop up upon reflection that do let you know the developers were onto some really good ideas. Or take the naming conventions in the game that have its characters divided between English or Japanese names. Why are characters like Emma, Violet, Brad the case, while other characters like Mikoto, Kunai, Shido, and Kagura are in Japanese? Or how, contrary to the idea of emotionally devoid characters, many of its characters are actually driven by a sense of despair and longing for others that intentionally betrays its assumptions that humanity can survive without unnecessary emotions. Or how the moon literally kills you if you stare up at it by its idea of a digitalized haven of Shambhala, as with its associations with Hindu or Buddhist ideas. The one thing I will give praise to is the environmental art design. In the almost 32 gigabytes that make up this game at launch, which is rather tiny for an Unreal Engine 5 game, the people responsible for making the visual scenarios and post-apocalyptic environments really deserve some recognition. The game heavily features asset reuse, but is used quite well in a way in which the areas you pass through all feel visually distinctive and interesting, even if the game isn't exactly filled with interesting things. But for many games around this price point and being AAA or AA quality, well, having good graphics and art design is kinda an expectation. Even so, the areas look phenomenal even if some of it's quite variable, with some of it being between a late PS3 or PS4 game, but that really is the end of my praise for the game. I think the issue foremost is the idea of what Emma is doing, and how her relationship to her other half, Ku, is a heavily implied journey of personal growth. Emphasis on implied. So early on, Emma is referred to as a vessel relating to the beast of reincarnation. The game not so subtly cues the player on this essentially through her ability to absorb the malefacts or major evils that threatens the world at the cusp of its end. The thing is, however, the story wants you to believe that she's slowly becoming more human or questioning her empty nature through her struggles and experiences through this sense of a journey. It does a really poor job at that, as at one point, she suddenly starts questioning asking why. That comes up rather unnaturally. And it's awkwardly paced to provide the impression that she should be doing so that doesn't really satisfyingly express how a robotic person becomes more human. A major issue on my part is the implication of something without directly or indirectly affirming or presenting this in a realizable or tangible way. The game has this consistent loop of going to an area and perhaps exploring, finding and defeating the Nushi, or the big bad responsible for blighting an area, and then rinse and repeat. The bits of story are often regulated to boss battles, revealed with a chat with Violet, the strange girl who's connected spiritually with Emma, and perhaps dialogue between Brad and Kunai. When they do somehow fit story in the moments between, with often dialogue between missions, in the mission, and so on, you don't actually see them doing anything, and that's my main problem. The illusion of implication, which is necessary of course, is not strong enough relative to what you're directly seeing and being presented. There seems like there isn't any consideration in actually making characters do something beyond the initial scope of what is presented, as I can understand the lack of facial animations, and perhaps the story justification of humanity removing their emotions in their evolution. Yet, the story is lacking in the sense that would let me know that Emma and Ku have a strong relationship, or the how. They're just kinda the ultimate pair without much struggle or understanding. For a game that primarily focuses on the dynamic of a girl and dog, well, I legitimately never felt like they expanded on any themes of how they trust each other, what little things that might make this connection stronger, or how even this connection shows up other than a flashback and the end revealing Ku's role. The thing is, Ku is actually Violet's body reincarnated in this lifetime, while Emma is the bodily vessel for Violet's soul. Therefore, the two are bound by the means of fate or something that is meant to be. However, by the extension of Emma's bond with Violet that shows that even a soulless husk can become human that grows as you play, my contention is about the part that also implies Ku having as much of its own will beyond Violet's, much the same as Emma. The parts, so to speak, are somehow more deeply connected to each other, or greater than the intended role they share. That's pretty alright, I guess, but I never got the idea that Ku is anything beyond a byproduct of Violet, or really just a dog for a dog's sake who just so happens to specifically have the keys to help Emma at the most opportune times. Ku, as you see and hear the dog in its few expressed lines, is the same consistent character throughout the runtime of the experience. That's fine and all, but I'm really struggling to see how Ku helps Emma essentially grow to become more human in that case. And there lies the problem. They just kinda expect you to run with the idea of an emotional comfort animal that helps a stunted character. The big reveal at the end to tie this together is poor at best, as if to justify why they couldn't actually put any scenes that enforce this idea that Ku becomes more self-aware like Emma, or just as important. It's a cheap explanation to reveal Cool's role as someone as destined, as if to say, oh yeah, we've thought about this, here's the reasoning, that feels more like they did not meaningfully express it prior, and expects the player to accept this retrofitted idea after the fact. I'm struggling to see how Cool even fits in the picture of a deep shared relationship given how the two are literally the key art of the product. Perhaps you can call it the show don't tell problem, but I'm not even sure they are directly even showing at times. Cool is just there. Arguably, Cool has practically zero plot significance other than its initial premise or a role as a helper to move the plot. You do witness how Cool essentially allows Emma to live initially, and how this dog somehow helps Emma retain her memories after she experiences amnesia later. And this sentiment is shared as Emma gives up her life for Cool to live at the end. But I gotta ask, where's the in-between to make such an impactful moment? Where does the player get shown any implication of the strength of this bond? It just kinda feels like the trope of, you should care about the dog just because man's best friend. Cool is just unwaveringly happy around Emma for most of their bonding scenes, which if you skipped, you didn't really miss much. To be fair, a dog isn't a human and they heavily implied understanding Cool beyond words, but frankly I don't think Cool gets any highlight as much as a major character rightfully should. They really put a dog in just to be a dog in this attempt at an emotional sci-fi story.
その時一緒にいるの
So the problem is that the game's loop uses the same exact format and presentation that never steers away from itself. Why, for instance, do they need cutscenes in which you have to fight the same exact boss for it to run away, move elsewhere? Or why does fighting it in the second phase always have to have the same drawn out framing of its evolution? Why the drawn out scene every time Emma and Cool absorb these red tendrils? Why do you need to see Cool and Emma have to dramatically fall over in unison every time? Why do you have to be briefed that you're going to the next area in which Emma is blankly staring ahead that just so happens to fit a context for both Brad and Ball-era later? Why is the only animation of Brad always holding awkwardly onto that steering wheel as if he has rigor mortis? Why do you have to show me Cool and Emma resting in the same exact posturing? Why does the game have to keep ending chapters with an attempt at a dramatic one-liner in a chapter title card? Why is the only animation for scenes ending a fade to black? It feels really amateurish in a way that betrays any attempt at an artistic flourish. I understand that there is a cyclic or intentionally slow and monotonous expression of Emma's single-minded nature, with an implication of missing something human as she's trying to claw back out some sort of meaning, but it's simply strange to consistently rely on these same techniques over and over. It's the idea that the scene or repeated presentations of the same sorts takes precedence and I would argue importance over what really should be the garnish, the flair so to speak, as it doesn't really do much by itself. This isn't helped that most of the game is outsourced as you can see by the credits, so unfortunately miscommunication or something else may be at fault of why they have to rely on previous mythology, as I'd like to think of Giga Wrecker, that relies on what they have done previously. The problem is that with this in mind of how they decided to structure the game, they decided to consistently repeat these sorts of things as the content, as it doesn't compensate for it in any meaningful way. Hence why it feels overly formulaic to a fault. You expect something new by the time they've shown you these drawn out elements several times over at this point, but it really doesn't do much beyond it. That's really boring for the player. So it's a very drawn out hodgepodge that can't figure out whether some sections should just be there for content to fill the game, or if it's for meaningful development of its characters and story. For instance, for a character so starkly insistent on reporting the truth, like in the flashback about reporting Cool, and having Violet admonish her and telling her what to do instead, Emma sure is secretive or protective of her invisible friend when others ask. That I would argue requires a level of emotional understanding or at least nuance to attempt to divert. So it feels inconsistent simply to extend the plot. Again, it has some cool lore relating to Hindu mythology as I'm pretty sure this figure is Shiva, but most of its attempts at subtlety or elements relating to the experiences of the actual characters falls flat. The little messages in Emma's experiences after she defeats particular enemies that serve as the lore or background storytelling doesn't really add much because they're really short statements that doesn't give you much to ponder about. But that also applies as much to the cast of characters. If I were to imagine how many characters it takes to create a story with a science fiction narrative with elements such as a metaphorical heaven, various colonies of peoples, a secret group with its own ambitions, decently large amounts of areas that become less filled and interesting over time unfortunately, somehow, Beast of Reincarnation feels like it has a bare minimum to make a story work. The notable cast of characters, if you can call it that, only has about 10 total, which it tries to pull from with a clear emphasis on only these characters to make up its story and dialogue. It's also strange to see that out of those characters that aren't part of Emma's core group, which I consider to be Brad, Kagura, Violet, Ku, and Ball-era, you don't see Shido, the administrator, Kunai, or Mikoto for practically the whole game in between. That also gives away arguably what happens, especially if you watched any of the trailers, that those who aren't part of your group can only be regulated as sources of conflict essentially. It's like, why would they make it so that the only characters that show up in the trailers are also the only ones that exist in any meaningful manner, as no one else exists in any capacity to fuel the story? They've shown their hand before they played it. But you could say that's not the point, as it's all about Emma's journey or whatever. When the game finally decides that Emma must make a major choice after Brad and Kunai have obviously been in cahoots in planning something, Brad makes Emma aware of the idea of her own agency, to kill the beast of reincarnation or not. He removes the poison collar restraint and gives her the option to fulfill her original mission, or follow in the idea that the beast of reincarnation isn't the issue. Brad also reveals that it's golems or Brahmin associated with the administrator who are at fault, and provides her the weapon to stop the beast's ability to regenerate so it can die, just in case. So the game attempts to stress the idea of Emma really thinking through her options by ascertaining truths first as she holds off on any decision. The thing is, however, that is just to give the impression that she is thinking about it on her own terms while providing a clear-cut answer. After Emma makes the choice to defy the administrator who holds reign over the beast, who is Mikoto, he reveals he is more than willing to ignore any loss of lives that makes it so practically everyone dies or succumbs to the blight in his attempt to reunite with his lover, Violet. So you're kind of forced to stop him, given how Emma cares about her friends and the idea of a home, or a place she belongs to, is going to disappear. So the half-baked idea of Emma's deliberation makes no sense given how the full truth is only found out at the very end moments, and with forced ultimatums. The beast has been secretly creating colonies to find the whereabouts of Violet after her data from Shambhala has dropped onto the Earth, and what the beast literally is are nanomachines that are responsible for the blight. Mikoto is literally the great evil with zero compromise, and with the most clear and obvious idea that Emma has to stop him. There are no mental struggles on Emma's part, as she already finds Violet, Ku, Ball-era, and Kagura her friends, and obviously they mean the world to her. The game clearly forces a choice when the story is leading up to her indecision for it to be structured as the most clear-cut and obvious lack of a choice. She has to very clearly stop the guy who's trying to literally kill everyone. Either way, how it's presented with Kunai betraying you on the way, and Brad dying, feels so intentionally forced to move some sort of plot in the last few chapters of the game that it's hard to say that anyone should be invested in this story. Things just happen to be the case that feels rushed. Everyone who isn't Emma, Kagura, or Violet doesn't have enough development time to easily make me care about them. The administrator being the one actually controlling the beast doesn't really matter. He dies, so whatever potential effect you would have over humanity by controlling it doesn't matter, especially as Kunai kills him anyway. Does it matter whatever resolve Emma has if someone conveniently clears the path for her? It feels like it robs Emma of her ability to make choices, if anything, as her anguish to become more human doesn't matter contrary to what the game is trying to imply. Also, the aha moment of Emma seemingly dying at the hands of Mikoto is really silly. Pardon me, as I know this sort of trope isn't from JoJo, but they really pulled a "it's the same sort of stand as the world" of why she didn't die from being impaled. She can regenerate and cannot die just like the beast. I don't like it, but it's whatever. What is actually worse is that it robs the idea of a final fight, as you actually can't lose. I suppose the challenge was the first two phases prior, but I would really have liked to see a true final boss fight at this point, and not one which still shares a moveset with other bosses. So like Game Freak's Giga Wrecker, I'm seeing the same use of combining a use of tropes and poorly stitched together threads to make an amalgamation of a story. Also, I dislike how characters have to outright state that Emma does indeed have a sense of existence beyond being a vessel, as Brad and Kunai are monitoring her to see if they should let her into their plan. If it was something they were particularly leaning on narratively, why did they need to explicitly state it? It's as if they didn't have the actual means of conveying it by the means of storytelling, and that was the only way to demonstrate that to the player. So finally, the combat. Everything others have said about the lacking enemy diversity in their attack movesets are true. The last time you actually see a new enemy that isn't a boss arguably is in Chapter 3 when they introduce the one that can do cool draw slashes and flings multiple daggers at you. Otherwise, the game really expects you to slog through 12 more chapters of whatever combinations of the same few enemies they have, as they introduce most enemy types by Chapter 2. This game has about 7 creatures, 11 sorts of golems, the big robot and the flower thing, a human being, and about 3 round ball type enemies. So that's about 24 enemies total. I could have accepted most of the faults of the game if the experience was consistent with new enemies or interesting variations, but if one of the main draws is the combat gameplay, well, if you don't flesh that out, I can't in good consciousness say it's good like these media outlets do. You don't react much differently for most enemies, as you won't find many of them that require any sort of nuanced, puzzle-like or rhythm back and forth flow state stuff, as I'd considered only 10 of the 24 to have some sort of gameplay that isn't parry up to 3 times before they die. And by the time you hit the later chapters with the same sorts of enemies, the experience is soured as they don't change the rather small pool of attack movesets. It's hard to say that there's any challenge later on therefore. It's really a novelty that while it is competent and engaging at points, the lack of anything new on either end of the player's abilities or the enemies makes the limited scope really apparent only after a few hours of gameplay. It's not worthy of praise alone for a developer to be doing something different than what they're used to if the experience falls flat after a few hours. The enemies don't scale well with the runtime of the game, and their only solution really is to throw multiple elite enemies at you at once, which really isn't a problem. The experience of seeing the same sort of enemies alongside my problem of its story presentation creates a multiplicatively worse experience as you witness it chapter by chapter. There's also the issue of relatively poor weapon balance. Weapons, or basically the 21 different sorts of swords, only have up to 3 upgrades in this game, and are really divided by the effect upon deflection, which are buffs, elemental infusions, or status effects for a limited time, or debuffs on enemies. The problem is that status infliction weapons are so strong that they trivialize the entire game. Whenever you build up a status, any enemy, including bosses, will automatically flinch. Because the overall combat system shares many of its elements from base encounters from the start of the game to the end, many of its combat elements share an unwillingness to challenge or push the player beyond a certain point, which I guess is a choice. But I can't understand why this finisher does so much damage. It's 2 normal swings into the double or triple ender, or the fastest way to reach a combo finisher that does both damage and stagger. Why is the game trivialized by basic abilities? I've never overleveled or grinded in any fashion, and I'm slightly underleveled actually at many points in the later chapters. And again, I am playing on hard mode. You can wait to build up a status to hit them with the ender, use Q to bind them to get a combo off, or use your build up slow time mechanic to instantly delete them with it. And if they survive it, they are nearly broken for a free finisher for non-bosses, and most bosses fold after 2 or 3 uses of it. To add on to this, weapon upgrades aren't the main source of your attack improvement, as it mainly comes from level ups and the first time food buffs. You can upgrade Ball Era, you're moving home, easily to achieve the level required by around chapter 6 or so. So the experience of upgrading is achieved rather quickly if you actually like even a little exploration. So that means you'll get the max level upgrades rather quickly, which renders the whole exploration and findings aspect of the game kinda worthless. The only other items they have are the amber currency, item crafting materials, or seedlings. It reminds me of 2018's God of War and its sequel Spoils that makes finding stuff feel incredibly boring. But going back to weapon balance, the difference of a status first weapon is the only slightly lower attack rating that's practically unnoticeable. The benefit is entirely in the slightly longer duration of the parry effect, so I guess it's kinda worth it to upgrade, though not really. But that brings up another problem. I understand in making sure that even players only running through the main story should have enough resources to upgrade, but you're never locked out of going back to explore and obtaining these items until the final boss anyway, which the game notes a point of no return. So very handholdy for no good reason. Q even randomly digs up these upgrades for you if your bond level is high enough, so yeah. It could also just be hard mode, but stats never felt like they really mattered. I purposely went with an all-rounder build with leveling all 3 types of stats equally to see if it would make a difference. Based on what I played, no, not really. Usually, I kill the enemies more often with just damage starting at the second half than filling up their break bar, so it's rather curious to see how a balanced build makes raw attack damage still apparent. You seem to die in about 2 to 3 hits overall regardless, which is fine, but doing everything possible to increase your stats doesn't seem to have any discernible impact. If I had very few issues on hard mode, I'm not sure what sort of balance exists on easy or normal mode. If anything, it wouldn't be any fun, I'd imagine. Speaking of which, there's hardly any RPG in this ARPG either. At no point in the game does the player's strength feel mitigated or considerations against any of your moveset or abilities become an idea in this game's combat system. Enemies resistant to a status? Doesn't matter, it doesn't take that much to give them a status anyway. The game also has no grabs, so it doesn't really punish positioning, but it's not a Souls-like game. You can stick to most enemies as the game doesn't really punish you too much for missing parries either, given how generous gaining back the 1 bar is. Most of the slottable pieces for your armor are not particularly interesting, and come in 3 tiers that are very similar to the materia slots in the Final Fantasy VII remakes. So if you're even half decent at parrying, as you really should be with how lenient it is on hard mode, just slot in the parry ones to gain more FP and you're solid. They have a dodge one too, but that one makes no sense how infrequent those red glints come up. I don't see builds being all that useful, as I had no issue steamrolling through the game with whatever they provided me. The time slowing ability by far is the worst offender, however, as it really is unlocked too early in. Given how easy it is to unlock more of the bar, well, the game provides such powerful unlocks early into the experience that you don't really need to level anything else really, and that is a shame. None of the other trees of Emma's side provide such a solid improvement of how you play other than the red offensive ones on the right side, and while the ranged weaponry stuff is alright at best if you want to remove priority targets on hard mode, I never felt the need to spend skill points to enhance it. That also applies to the middle hair skill tree as well. You can customize cool skills by adding additional costs with modifications to his various skills, but I don't think you ever need to. I was running most skills with only an HP heal mod, or not at all. The tier 2 versions of the skills cost more than the base ones, which arguably, it's better to save your points to go for the repeated status inflictions rather than the higher numbers or AoE effects. And to compound this, if you want to explore these entirely optional choices, you gotta grind out enemies for skill points. You don't get enough running through the game and exploring, especially as you share points between Emma and Ku, so I suppose that's their way of encouraging New Game Plus, as you only get 1 to 2 points per kill when skills can cost over 50 later on. But the game is unfortunately so easy without utilizing most, if not all, the mechanics on hard mode, which ultimately defeats the point of an ARPG. If I can handle all the challenges without really looking for a build or desiring to, well, what's the point, right? I don't play these sorts of games with the strongest abilities, just so I could dive deeper into the combat mechanics to appreciate what's there and gain a sense of mastery over it. And nothing in this game makes me want to learn more about it, unfortunately. So nothing about the combat system, customization, or anything related to it feels like it's doing something beyond what is required to make it just functional. It's serviceable at best, and while there is some interesting tech you can pull off, well again, I never felt the need to do it. Nothing really asks you to rebuild or rethink your strategy in any discernible way. The most consistent thing you can do is interrupt enemies mid-swing by inflicting a status or bind. I wish there were counter skills or something like that for the turn-based aspect like an auto parry state skill. Otherwise, in no way or fashion does the combat system deserve any major praise. It works is all I can say, but doesn't do much after that. It's quite shallow as enemies don't react back to what you're doing, say like buffing, debuffing, or dodging certain sorts of attacks that are practically the baseline in expressing enemy actions in other third-person action games. Worst of all is that they're all incredibly predictable after you fought them so many times prior already. And on bosses specifically, well, they have poor camera work that's being worked on, shared movesets between other bosses, a similar lack of movesets as basic enemies, if not worse, and you fight them too many times. I recall some people saying that there's actually only about 6 in the game, and I'd agree. I don't consider the larger versions of the boar, bear, and bird enemies to be actual bosses, as they only have a few more moves at best, but otherwise, they function exactly like their minor counterparts. How that sort of stuff gets past design or QA is beyond me, but hey, at least they're fixing some of it. Repeating Shido as a generic enemy tie-in to the story's cloning is honestly a poor choice in my opinion, as they're trying to justify a poor choice simply because it was mentioned as a story element. It seems like a very thinly veiled thing, more so an excuse than a strongly considered artistic choice. It doesn't help that he fights in the same exact way as the boss counterpart does. Also, Ku's fight is terrible. Whoever decided to reuse the same wolf enemy AI with an additional attack or two, I am perplexed to say the least. There was no real lead up, hardly any emotional impact. It's like, oh hey, the dog is back, neat. And then it's kinda overshadowed right afterwards by the scene with Violet and Emma anyhow that has the most raw emotion in the entire game. So yes, it really is that bad, and I don't want anyone to buy this game knowing that they are getting something that barely reaches past its initial premise, at least combat and story-wise. I myself didn't think the game was too bad until nearing the second half of the game, as the experience practically deteriorates into a nothing burger by the time you've hit the 5th or 6th chapter. I could rag about the graphics and performance, but I didn't really have an issue in that regard. I can overlook mediocre or poor graphics or common Unreal Engine 5 performance woes, but if the gameplay and particularly combat doesn't do it, well, I gotta ask, why would I play an overstretched game to witness some drawn out cutscenes? Ideally, all these things should blend together that hopefully lets the player enjoy its artistic endeavors. The music becomes a bit grating as the loop is really quite short, but I think it's good overall for setting the mood. I don't think many of the reviews praising the game will talk about how rampant asset reuse is applied as it concerns the hull. Almost everything about the game seems to me to have the philosophy of, can this be reused? If so, do so, that cannot be unseen once you realize it. The same exact boss double swings or evasion timings. The same small pool of NPCs used for colonies that have babyface skin that runs contradictory to abject poverty and backbreaking labor. Emma's same response to seeing a camp or her short amount of responses for Ku's item notification. The same stutter applied to exactly one word for Kagero's statements. I can understand if it's a small-time indie studio doing this, but I don't think Game Freak should get a pass for this. It needs way more time in the oven. If the game was half as long, focusing on a tighter story with more enemy variety, I think I would have been entirely satisfied with it. But it has so many design issues that I have a hard time thinking that anyone should be recommending this game. I'd wait for a deep sale and hopefully some extensive updates if you're interested in the slightest in playing this game, as it has the sort of issues that are too far baked into its design that really feels like they didn't do justice bringing their ideas in a meaningfully realized way. Still, I'm very glad they're trying something different, but I still see the same old Game Freak in many ways. For me, that's ultimately a no. Thanks for watching, and I hope this was informative or useful.
ゲーム性、世界観設定、ナラティブ。そういう分け方が正しいのか。
あなたが将軍。でかいの。
やはり美しいピクセルアートのゲームは素晴らしい。ドラマティックな音楽とピクセルアートが見事にマッチしている。だが、フル 3D も否定するものではないな。本当に没入できる空気感あふれる素晴らしい作品も。
ねえ、電気ボルトの調合書はどこ？
それなら要塞の格納庫だ。
何を話してるの？
わしは研究に忙しいんじゃ。用がないなら邪魔するでない。
わかった。何の話だったの？わからん。